The heavy mahogany doors swung open, and the sound of polished Italian leather shoes echoed across the marble floors of the mansion. The billionaire, Richard Grant, had returned home earlier than anyone expected. His face still carried the sharpness of corporate wars fought in skyscraper boardrooms, his eyes tired from negotiations worth billions. He wanted nothing more than silence, a glass of aged wine and solitude. But instead, what he saw stopped him cold in his tracks. His maid, in her black and white uniform, standing in front of a large whiteboard, her hand moving gracefully as she wrote complex equations and formulas. And there, sitting cross-legged on the chair, was his 7-year-old son, Daniel, gazing at her with awe, as if he were watching a magician perform. The maid wasn't cleaning. She wasn't dusting. She wasn't vacuuming the endless corridors of this mansion. She was teaching No Mentoring, his child with mathematics so advanced that Richard himself hadn't touched it since his Ivy League years. For a moment, he thought his mind was deceiving him. A maid teaching advanced calculus? Impossible. But the chalkboard didn't lie. The formulas were real, and so was her brilliance. Before we go further into this heart-stirring story, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of hidden potential, please take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Fablebox. Stories like this deserve to be remembered and retold, and your support makes it possible. Richard froze in the doorway, his mouth slightly open. The chandelier above glittered softly, casting golden light onto the surreal scene before him. His maid Maria didn't notice him. Her focus was on little Daniel, who scribbled notes furiously in his notebook. "Now remember, Daniel," she was saying, "mathematics is not about memorizing numbers. It's about patterns. It's about understanding the universe's language." The words struck Richard like thunder. He couldn't remember the last time he had taught his son anything meaningful. His world had been about mergers, acquisitions, stock prices, and courtrooms. The boy's world had been left in the hands of nannies, tutors, and occasional phone calls. Yet here was Maria, the woman he barely acknowledged each day, giving his son something he had never managed to give: inspiration. Richard's mind was a storm. Memories came flooding back. How Maria had come into their service years ago, humble, quiet, hard-working. She was always polite, never intrusive, always blending into the background of their luxurious life. To him, she was just another staff member. Nothing more, nothing less. But now, watching her explain the intricacies of advanced formulas with ease, he realized he had never truly seen her. He had never asked where she came from, what she knew, what dreams she once had. Daniel's small voice broke his trance. "Miss Maria, does this mean I can solve problems that even adults can't?" Maria smiled gently, her eyes warm. "Yes, Daniel. You are capable of far more than you realize. All it takes is curiosity and courage." Richard felt a lump rise in his throat. Courage, that word haunted him. For years, he had built empires, but had been too much of a coward to step into his son's world. He had justified it as providing for the family, but standing there, he realized money could never buy the spark he was witnessing. He wanted to walk away. He wanted to retreat before anyone noticed his presence, but his feet refused to move. His heart demanded answers. Finally, Maria turned slightly and gasped when she saw him standing there. Her hand froze mid-air, and the marker trembled between her fingers. "Sir, I didn't expect you home so early," she stammered. Daniel turned too, his face lighting up with joy. "Dad, look! Miss Maria's teaching me math. Real math, like the kind geniuses do." Richard forced a smile, but his eyes were locked on Maria. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice steadier than he felt. Maria lowered her gaze, her confidence melting into nervous humility. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to overstep. Daniel was curious about the equations on my old notebook one day, and Old notebook?" Richard interrupted, surprised. "Yes," Maria whispered. "I used to study engineering back home, but life..." Her words trailed off, her voice breaking ever so slightly. And just like that, the billionaire's world shifted. Maria's story began to unfold in Richard's mind, like pieces of a puzzle he had ignored for years. She was not just a maid. She was once a scholar, a dreamer, someone who had ambitions buried under the weight of poverty, loss, and circumstances crueler than imagination. Yet here she was, not complaining, not bitter, but pouring what little she had left into his child. That night Richard could not sleep. The image of Daniel's eager face and Maria's steady patience haunted him. For the first time in decades, he felt powerless, not because of failing business deals, but because of a realization that his billions had blinded him from the treasures right under his nose. The days that followed were different. Richard began watching quietly from the shadows as Maria tutored his son. He saw the way she tailored each lesson to Daniel's curiosity, blending stories, analogies, and laughter into formulas that would have seemed daunting to anyone else. He saw how Daniel, once restless and easily distracted, now sat for hours with a focus sharper than Richard had ever seen. But what touched him most was how Maria taught values hidden inside mathematics: patience, resilience, humility. When Daniel failed to solve a problem, she never scolded. Instead, she said, "Every mistake is proof that you're trying, and every great discovery in the world was built on mistakes." Richard's hardened heart softened. He began to see his son transform, not just academically, but as a little human being filled with hope, confidence, and empathy. And it was not because of his wealth, his status, or his power. It was because of Maria. One evening, as Richard sat silently in the corner of the study, Maria finally approached him. Her voice was hesitant but steady. "Sir, if you'd prefer, I will stop teaching him. I know it's not my place." But Richard interrupted her, his voice breaking. "Maria, you've given my son more than I ever could. Please don't stop." In fact, he paused, realizing the gravity of his next words. "I want to know more about you. I want to know why someone like you ended up here." Maria's eyes widened in shock. Slowly, she told him about her past, how she had been a top student in her country, dreaming of becoming an engineer to design bridges and schools for underprivileged children. But tragedy struck when her father died, leaving her family drowning in debt. She had no choice but to leave her studies and take up work as a domestic helper overseas. Her story pierced Richard's soul. For the first time in his life, he felt ashamed, not of her position, but of his own blindness. He realized he had walked past greatness every single day, too consumed by profit margins to notice. From that day, Richard made a decision. He would not let Maria's brilliance go unnoticed. He began arranging for her to pursue further studies again, offering her resources and support. But to his surprise, Maria declined. "Sir, I appreciate it more than you know," she said softly. "But right now my greatest joy is helping Daniel. If he can become the man he's meant to be, that will be enough for me." Tears burned Richard's eyes. In that moment, he saw what true wealth looked like, not in the vaults of his banks, not in his sprawling mansions, but in the heart of a woman who had lost everything yet still chose to give. Weeks passed, and Richard's relationship with his son began to transform too. He started spending more time at home, sitting quietly during the lessons, asking questions, even learning alongside Daniel. His board members noticed he was different, less harsh, more patient, more human. They didn't know that the reason was a maid who reminded him of life's greatest equation: love plus sacrifice equals legacy. But just when things seemed perfect, life tested them. One day, Richard received a call from his legal team warning him that word had spread about his maid teaching his son. Some shareholders mocked him, saying it was unprofessional, even dangerous, to let household staff influence the heir of his empire. What will people think? They sneered. The old Richard would have cared deeply. But the new Richard only smiled. For the first time, he knew exactly what mattered. The whispers grew louder. Board members, old friends, and even some relatives of Richard questioned his judgment. They said he was tarnishing the family name by allowing a maid to act as a teacher. Social media, always hungry for scandal, twisted the story into clickbait headlines. Billionaire's maid becomes tutor. Is his son's future at risk? For a man like Richard, reputation had always been currency. But as he stood in his son's study one evening, watching Daniel's eyes light up while Maria explained a complex geometric proof, he realized something profound. Reputation meant nothing if it wasn't backed by truth. And the truth was that Maria had done what no elite tutor or expensive private school had ever managed. She had unlocked Daniel's heart. Still, the pressure mounted. Investors hinted at withdrawing support. Journalists began circling the mansion. Even Daniel's school principal called Richard, politely suggesting he hire a qualified professional instead of relying on domestic help. Each word was a dagger, testing his resolve. But Richard had changed. He looked at his son, who was blossoming under Maria's care, and at Maria, whose humility and resilience shone brighter each day. For the first time in years, he felt alive, purposeful. So he stood firm. Let them talk, he told himself. They don't see what I see. Then fate dealt another blow. One late night, Richard found Maria sitting alone in the kitchen, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes red from crying. She tried to hide it, but Richard, now more attentive than ever, noticed. He sat across from her and waited. Finally, Maria whispered, "Sir, I've received a letter. My mother is very ill, back home. I need to go." The words cut through him like a blade. He realized how much his family had come to depend on her, not just for lessons, but for the warmth, the kindness, the life she brought into their cold mansion. Yet he also knew he couldn't keep her from her family. "I'll help you," Richard said firmly. "Whatever it takes. Medical care, expenses, consider it done." But Maria shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You've already done too much. I don't want charity. I just need to be there." Richard leaned forward, his voice gentle but resolute. "This isn't charity, Maria. This is gratitude. You've given my son and me something I can never repay. Let me do this, not as your employer, but as someone who finally understands what it means to care." Maria's walls crumbled. For the first time, she let her pain spill out. She told him about the crushing guilt she carried for leaving her family behind, the dreams she had buried, the loneliness of working in a foreign land. Richard listened, not as a billionaire but as a man, humbled and broken by her strength. Within days, arrangements were made. Richard's private jet flew Maria back to her homeland, carrying not just her, but also doctors and supplies. He visited her village himself weeks later, shocked at the poverty, yet inspired by Maria's quiet determination to still give back. He saw how the villagers respected her, how children gathered around her whenever she spoke, hungry to learn. It was then Richard had an idea that would change everything. He returned home and told Daniel, "Your Miss Maria isn't just a teacher, she's a hero, and we're going to help her build something lasting." So began the project that would define Richard's legacy, a foundation dedicated to education in underserved communities. And at its heart was Maria, not as a maid, not as a helper, but as the director, the visionary, the mentor. Her name, once hidden in the shadows, began to shine. When Maria returned months later, Daniel ran into her arms, tears streaming down his face. "I thought you wouldn't come back," he whispered. Maria smiled through her own tears. "I promised I'd never stop teaching you, didn't I?" The lessons resumed, But now they were different. Sometimes they were in the study. Sometimes they were outdoors, under the vast blue sky, where Maria explained the physics of a bird's flight or the geometry of tree branches. And sometimes Richard joined them, not as the distant billionaire, but as a father relearning the beauty of discovery. Slowly, the world began to notice. News outlets that once mocked him now praised him. Investors who doubted him now respected him more. But Richard cared little for their approval. All that mattered was Daniel's laughter, Maria's fulfillment, and the countless children whose lives their foundation touched. Years passed. Daniel grew into a young man, brilliant and compassionate, carrying with him the lessons Maria had instilled. And Richard, older and wiser, often thought back to that one day he had come home early, the day he had stumbled upon his maid writing equations on a whiteboard. That day had rewritten the equation of his life, and when people asked Richard what the greatest investment of his career had been, he would smile and answer, "It wasn't a company. It wasn't a building. It was a woman who reminded me that true wealth lies in lifting others." Before we end, if this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Fablebox. Your support helps us bring more real, emotional, and life-changing stories to you. And here's a special request. Comment below with the word INSPIRE if Maria's journey inspired you today. Let's fill the comments with positivity and gratitude.